What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm Lucas Pesa, and I'm joined today once again by Saab of eXplorance. How are you doing today, Samir?
I'm doing well. Good talking to you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a conversation a little while ago pertaining to obviously the subject matter around your panel discussion that's going to take place at our conference April 25th, and that's the nuances of the policy of non-policy, the ways in which managers can really implement a culture of innovation, but on an independent basis. Obviously, in our previous conversation, we talked about the number of online resources that employees have to access that enables them to learn a little bit more independently, and how this sort of best practice, or rather the practice of creating this policy of non-policy, it's not exactly mainstream yet, just because it is still, companies are still sort of tinkering and experimenting with it, but we both sort of see that in the next few years it is definitely going to become more prevalent. So today, though, we're going to be taking that conversation a little bit further by talking specifically about, now that we understand what the nuances around the context of creating the policy of non-policy is, what today we'll be discussing is specifically how to create and implement that specific strategy in an organization, and what the tangible ways to do that are for managers. So, I guess the sort of opening broad question to ask is, what's a good way to define a strategy of non-policy, or a policy of non-policy, whatever you want to call it? What's a way that we can define that?
Sure. So, the way we call it here is culture of free will, which is the same. And the premise behind it is that we don't want to have to oversee what everybody is doing and tell them how they should do it. Mm-hmm. To start with, at the fundamentals of it. And the goal behind it, obviously, is to be able to allow people the freedom to make the right choices, and the right choices is critical in this case. We're not saying to make any choice, but the right choices. And we've been in the policy world when we did our first growth spur, and I caught my manager running around the Christmas holidays, and actually following up on which employee did not fill up their day off for, yet they were not there. And they actually, literally, two of them called me at home on December 27th to flag that massive problem to me, right? So if you look at the fundamentals of it, is that we're spending a lot of time trying to police people that we're hiring and we're empowering with roles that are very strategic for the company. And the fundamental definition of us is that if you have the right people, if you have the right environment, the right strategies and culture, you will not have to police people. You will actually allow them to thrive.
And what do you think of when we talk about management, and we talk about how to create this sort of culture and how to implement it strategically? Mm-hmm. How much do you think time in the office should be considered as important, and how much do you think strictly output should be considered as important? How much value are in those two separate ideas, being in the office versus how much an employee is producing?
Absolutely. So, yeah, and that's the discussion. Even today we're going around the discussion of, when we talk about free will, we're not talking that you can do anything.
Yeah.
If your role requires you to be at the office, then you have to be at the office. Nobody's going to force you.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the culture part and how it's self-regulating on its own anyway. But the premise is you could be part of customer service department. And if you actually decide that you don't want to be internally, and you get a call from a client for an issue, how are you going to go around to development or QA or somebody and be able to understand more and be able to address the customer needs? So the premise that comes with that freedom is you have to make sure you're responsible not only for your own success, you're responsible for the success of those around you, primarily your colleagues, the interest of business, the interest of your family, your well-being, etc. So it's a balance. I'm a personal believer that the power of culture comes from community, which means the more we are all together, the more we're able to perform. But if there are situations that make it that we cannot be together, then nobody's going to come and make a fuss about it. It's normal whether it's 6 months or 9 months. We have some people that travel to other countries for 6-9 months just because they have to or they want to even, and say, fine, you're still an employee with us, you're still on payroll, you're still working, and that's okay because your private life took over. But if that doesn't, our preference actually on the balance is the more we spend together just so we can get the power of collectivity from the community of the employees, the better it is.
And you actually touched on something that I thought was interesting. One thing you mentioned was that, the idea of policing people and how it can sort of create a not necessarily a hindrance, but it can it has a certain type of an effect on a person's employee basis creativity, innovation, that kind of thing. So, when you say organizations should be careful about policing people and that kind of thing,
yes.
How do you sort of reconcile that? What's a way that you can sort of decide, okay, this is a good time to really put a policy in place where things are going to be regulated, and when can managers step back and say, okay, we've given them flexibility to do this, this, and this, but we should also keep in mind that we have to provide some rigid policies to make sure people stay on track.
Absolutely. So, obviously the way I look at it is, unfortunately, there's no phase into something like that. You cannot phase into freedom, let's say.
Yeah.
So the way personally I experienced it is at one point it did not make sense. So I made an executive decision, brought everybody on board, and make 3 very strong statements. And the first one was, anyone can take the time off they need. Need is a keyword here, and we're not saying they won't.
Exactly.
As long as they keep the best interest of their colleagues and company in mind. And no manager can say no. And if they want to refuse, they need CEO approval, right? Yep. That was one of the 3 statements I made. And the big premise behind it is I knew it will be difficult. I knew that people that were managed or executives that have been using authority for years and leveraging policy to be able to control things in the company are going to have a massive issue with that.
Yeah.
And it took a good 2-3 years to align everybody to it, and still have the occasional person, a manager that would come to me and say, that vacation, no policy doesn't work. And I asked them, why does it not work? And they would say, because 4 of my employees decided to take time off at the same time. And my typical answer is that means you failed in leadership, because if you actually set enough responsibility and accountability in them, they would never have done that. And the year after, it never happened again. So it is a process, but I think at first it needs executive support and very strong executive support.
Yeah.
The second part that I felt enticed to do is I needed to stay connected to the roots of the company. So all the employees at any point in time, because I had to remind them of their rights constantly, because it's easy to see management and executive layers until they get accustomed to it, go back to the zone of comfort of saying, no, you can't take time off. And I'm using time off as an example, as obviously across the board on the rest of the policies. And, the irony of it is when we analyze the results, because that we can analyze, the people that were abusing of policy are the same people that are abusing of no policy. But there are half of them here today. So that answers the second part, is that when the culture is strong enough, when everybody starts believing in it, when everybody starts enjoying it, then they protect it. And they know that if people abuse it a lot, then we'll be forced to go back to policy. So what happens is it's kind of a self-ejecting role. So in general, people that don't fit in the culture will either leave on their own or somehow are in a situation where they end up being let go. So it's become self-sustainable now. But it took a good 2 years of my personal commitment as CEO to be involved at every single point to make sure that nobody derails it.
And how, because one thing you just mentioned is how, you had to communicate directly with the managers about how when you're implementing this policy of flexibility, you also have to make sure that you infuse a culture that people understand they still have responsibilities at their organization to their colleagues. How do you approach those conversations with your managers if they're trying to figure out how to create that sense of accountability while creating that same sense of flexibility? How do you approach those conversations with your managers?
Absolutely. So usually what we do is we actually have an ongoing once-a-month CEO to management layer meeting where we discuss case by case, every single case where the manager had a challenge dealing with something. For example, one of the managers, they had one of their employees said, I have to go back home for a month. Back home is out of here. and I will work remotely for that month. And the manager didn't like it, and they didn't know how to handle it. So that's an example. They would come and throw it around the table.
Yeah.
Then there's about 15 of us around the table. We all discuss it. We all give advice, etc. And then, when you hear 15 use cases every month, over time it becomes collective knowledge.
Yep.
That is there. So that's one way to do it. Or in general, either the employee affected by it or the manager would typically come to me or go to HR or go to someone and right away expose the thing. And then every opportunity we get to kind of use it as an opportunity to learn, adapt the culture and adapt the leadership style of people is a step forward in the right direction. We're not saying it's flawless. Obviously, there's a reason we meet every month, and there's a reason 15 people can come up with one use case a month.
Yeah.
And we're only 100 some employees. So definitely it's something that takes commitment, investment to get there.
Yeah.
But the other side of it, and I always say it, I always wonder, when I'm stopped at a red light crossing the street, because I see a policeman on the other side, I say, how do they see the world from their eyes? Because that's policing for me. They see that the minority of people cross, jaywalk.
Yeah.
But the reality is when they're not there, the picture is exactly the opposite. So, I tend to think and believe that, the more policing you can do in an organization, you think things are happening the right way, but our results have shown that those that abuse of policies are going to abuse of no policy. The only difference is they're responsible for their abuse when you don't have policy. They're not responsible when they actually use the policies to the extreme that it allows you.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing you mentioned, obviously, because with your meetings with your managers, you guys obviously communicate, and it probably after a while becomes sort of muscle memory that, okay, this has happened, so now if this happens again, we know how to approach it, that kind of thing. When you initially started implementing this style of management, how were you able to get buy-in from those same managers, from your executives? Yeah. I
did not. So actually, unfortunately, and it makes sense. It's a big change. We're asking people that are used to 5 competencies that you need to be an effective leader.
Yeah.
To unlearn those 5 competencies and learn 5 new competencies. You need to be strong in leadership. You have to be strong in leadership as an example. You need to be strong in authority. You have to be strong in influence. You needed to be strong in politics. Now you need to be strong in negotiation. So the thing is, it shifts completely the set. So nobody's comfortable with change.
Yeah.
The way I looked at it is we were lucky that we grew fast enough that we were able to remember the rules.
Yeah.
And when we reached that level where we were half of where we are today, and we introduced these policies, and I started seeing all these levels of politics and silos and all these things take place. And I remembered what made us strong before. And that's why I was going to, it was easy for me to come and actually say, I'm going to make that statement. I'm going to make it firm. But I know I'm going to get resistance. I know from the get-go, a lot of people won't agree. Now, we didn't have a lot of middle management. At the time, we had more executives because we were still, less than 50 employees when we implemented it. But the reality is they were all utterly against it. I forced it. I connected with the roots. And I took probably a good 2 years of my time before we even did the management layer, but that was easier because managers you build up, whereas executives typically we tended to hire from outside, so there was a bigger shift of work to do with them. But it took 2 years, and if I look today, half the executive team is fully on board.
Yeah.
The other half, if they get an opportunity that it goes back to policy, they probably jump on that opportunity. But the reality is they don't have to manage people at the size we've reached because the people that are managing people are managers and they're all 100% sold into that management style. It allows you to actually do your work rather than just push papers and admin and obsessed with who's breaking the eXplorance law and who's not.
Yeah. And there's a real sense of, whenever organizations are trying to create this new policy, or whenever organizations are trying to really put something in that changes the way in which a company is going to be managed, there is, there's always that question of communication and how, because everybody at some level is going to be involved in the change. And, to your point, you even mentioned that at the very beginning when this was proposed, very few people, if any, were on board, and it took time to really get people to come around. So the question of sort of communication and the ability of being able to get people on board and going through that transition process is always something that managers I find are very interested to learn about. And and I think that coming in the next few years, and I think we even discussed this in our previous conversation, that in the next probably actually in the not too distant future, these sorts of policies will become a lot more mainstream, especially because of all the ways that people have access to online learning resources, and they have a lot more ability to learn things independently that can move their careers forward and that kind of thing. So there's a real sense, in my opinion, as well, that these sorts of practices are going to be a bit more and more recognized, especially as technology changes the way we learn and changes the way that we retain and recruit and onboard employees to organizations.
Absolutely.
Well, Samir, again, appreciate you taking the time to jump on the podcast with us. We've had two great conversations with you now, and we're looking forward to having you on April 25th. So like I said, we appreciate you having these conversations with us, and we're looking forward to getting all three of you on a panel on the actual day of the event to see what kind of ideas you guys can exchange together. So.
I look forward to that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. For those interested in following Samir Saab or learning a little bit more about eXplorance, you can follow them on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And obviously, you can follow them through their website at eXplorance.com. And obviously, if you want to take a look at Great Place to Work, we've got our conference coming up April 25th. You can check us out at greatplacetowork.ca and give us a follow on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter as well. For those interested in coming to our conference this coming April, we have been approved for 6 hours of credit towards your HR designation. So we'd love to be able to have you so that you can obviously get that credit for your time with us as well, and learn a lot of great things through not only our panelists but our speakers as well. Samir, again, we appreciate you taking the time, and thanks very much for joining us on this episode.
It was my pleasure.